Hello, everyone. Welcome to Friday's edition of Weekend Waypoints, a production of SEC Extra and D1Baseball.com. Joe Healy here, getting you ready for the single SEC Super Regional game we have coming up Friday. That's Tennessee and Evansville. All the four others all start tomorrow. So Saturday morning show going to be a little more jam packed than this one. But we'll get you ready for the Tennessee game today. We're also going to talk a little bit about, South Carolina's. Can you tell these are the first words I've spoken out loud this morning? We're also going to talk about South Carolina's coaching search. Now Mark Kingston is out. Talk a little bit about that, but first let's get to the baseball part of it. Tennessee and Evansville starting today, kicking off the SEC's run through Super Regionals. 3 p.m. Eastern time, should be even mid-afternoon. On a Friday, Knoxville should be raucous. Looking forward to that atmosphere. I will be probably listening at least to the beginning of that one on the radio. I'll be driving down to Clemson. I'll be at the Clemson Super Regional against Florida this weekend. So I'll be driving down there, listening to the Tennessee game along the way. And look, this on paper is the mismatch you think it is. Tennessee has the best lineup in the country. Tennessee has pitching depth, pitching talent, pedigree. They're whatever their record is, 50 some odd and 11. This is that mismatch, right? No disrespect to Evansville. Evansville, a really nice year. What they did last weekend was impressive. Anybody who goes into East Carolina, even if East Carolina plays tight at home, in the postseason, which sometimes happens, still, that's pretty impressive for somebody to go into that atmosphere, because that's not an easy place for opposing teams to play. That being said, if you're Tennessee, you have to play well, right? I mean, you can't. The absolute worst thing you can do is waltz in there and assume that you can play a C+ game and expect to win. Now, you might. If you play a C+ game, you very well might win. You might go 2-0. But that's not really a risk you want to take. So you do have to kind of stay locked in, and I have to imagine there's some part of Tony Vitello and his staff that, saw this as a particular type of challenge, because it's one thing if you've got Florida State on the opposite end, right? And you could say, like, look, this is Florida State. This is a team that's been to Omaha however many times. They've been to the regionals 50 times, not quite, but something like that. It's a brand name. You know what to expect here. I mean, that's easy to get your team up for, right? But Evansville, that's a little tougher. And there probably was some element of, and I would too in their shoes. I'm not even criticizing. As a player, you see Evansville win that regional across from you, and you're like, oh, okay, we got this, right? And so, you do have to lock back in. So it'll be interesting to see how sharp Tennessee is coming out of the gate. The pitching matchup, Tennessee sticking with what they've been doing. It's Chris Stamos, I assume, as an opener. Expect AJ Causey to come in at the first sign of anything, right? That's kind of the way they've been doing that. It's been working. When I talked to coaches about this matchup, the most raved about pitcher on Tennessee's staff was AJ Causey. And you can see it in the Knoxville Super Regional preview that we have up on our site, that the praise for him is effusive from opposing coaches. Of like, one coach said, when that guy comes in the game, if they have a lead, like, that's it. Like, that's a wrap. That's how good he is. And another one said, or it might have been the same guy, I forget. It was just like, he knows what he's throwing. He knows what he's throwing, and it just doesn't matter. Like, he's just going to throw it up there and challenge you, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. Like, that's the way it's gone all year. So anyway, that'll be today for Tennessee. Kenton Deverman is on the mound for Evansville, and that's an interesting matchup. I mean, he pitched great against East Carolina in the regional opener a week ago today. He's really tough on lefties. So if you're Blake Burke, if you're Dylan Dreiling, that's a tough matchup. However, one of the issues East Carolina ran into is, like, ECU will run like 8 left-handers out there on a given day at the plate. And so Deverman was a particularly tough matchup for ECU given that. Less so, of course, for Tennessee, because Tennessee has a lot more lineup balance left-right. So if Deverman doesn't have the success against right-handers that he doesn't get lefties, which is on paper what happens, you'd think Tennessee would be a little more able to handle it. Now, that being said, the challenge with him is that he's feeling himself right now. He's going to come in there. He's not going to be freaked out by Lindsey Nelson Stadium in the moment. in part because of what he did last weekend. Fastball up, it's not premium velocity, but it does have a little bit of ride in the zone. So, that fastball up, he's going to look to use as a weapon, get people to chase out of the zone because it looks good, but the ball kind of appears like it's taken off a little bit. It's got that induced vertical break. So he's got some stuff. Like it's not high-end SEC starter stuff, but he's also not a slop tossing lefty. Let's put it that way. So it's kind of somewhere in between there. One thing I would, from a Tennessee standpoint, one thing you have to be cognizant of is that you're going to have to take a punch from Evansville because they're going to be jacked up for this. The first couple innings, they're going to come out with a lot of energy. And so if you're Tennessee, you have to understand that's coming and you have to withstand it and know that you'll be fine if you play your game. I mean, that's kind of the moral of the story is in the same way that tennis players sometimes say, the game is on my racket, meaning if I play my game, it doesn't really matter what the opponent does. This game is on Tennessee's racket, so to speak, where if they play their game, there's nothing Evansville can do. If Tennessee plays its game and plays well, it's when they start to make mistakes or they get tight or they panic, any of that stuff, where it gets kind of dicey. And so they need to be prepared to take a punch from Evansville because Evansville's going to come out ready to go. And their offense is good enough, by the way. Like it's an old offense. It's a veteran offense. It's a dynamic offense. They've got guys who can hit for power, guys who can run. It wouldn't surprise me if they come out and put a couple runs on Stamos because they've seen in the Valley, like as good. Chris Stamos is a good pitcher. They've seen guys like him in the Missouri Valley, though. Guys with fastballs that get into low 90s, guys with sweeping breaking balls like that. That exists in the Valley. What they're not going to have seen is someone with like the high spin stuff of Causey that combined with the velo, and then they're not going to have seen a reliever with the stuff of Marcus Phillips in the Valley. Really, just there are certain things that are Nate Snead, obviously. That's where the differentiators are. But it wouldn't surprise me if they put a couple runs on Stamos, just because it's a little more of a comfortable matchup for them, and they're going to come out with that energy. So their top bats, Mark Schallenberger, a veteran outfielder, hits for some power, can run a little bit, plays a good outfield. Kip Fugers started his career in Indiana, ended up at Evansville. He's really found his stride. I think he's got 21 bombs on the year. He will strike out, though. You can strike him out. Like that's the thing. Schallenberger never strikes out. Fugers will strike out. So that's a key for them. And look, if the ball's flying this weekend, it wasn't excessively flying last weekend, but if the ball's flying this weekend and Evansville gets some balls in the air, they've got the power to run some balls out of the yard. So that's where it could get a little bit dicey. If that first punch from Evansville involves home runs, that's where instead of 1-0 or 2-0, it could be 4-0, and then Tennessee has a little more work to do. But again, Tennessee stays calm, it absorbs that, keeps coming. If they play their game, they're going to be all right. Let's look at some comments here. Trevor says, "Let's go Dogs." Yep, that'll start. That one will start tomorrow. That should be a fun matchup in Athens. Shotgun Spratling will be there covering that one. Nick Hammonds on YouTube says, "Oregon State versus Kentucky is the matchup I'm looking forward to the most. Towards the most." I might be too. I haven't really thought a lot about this. I think it's the most intriguing. Burt Granger will be there covering that one. And yeah, it just feels like random's not the right word because we know how this happened, but like, it's just such an interesting pairing. Oregon State and Kentucky, two very different programs, opposite ends of the country, obviously. And that's a tough matchup for Kentucky as the number 2 overall seed. Like you're thinking, okay, the 15 host, even if they come through, even if they come through, like that's a team that we feel pretty good about handling. But then it turns out the 15 seed is Oregon State, who kind of sleepwalked through part of their season. And that's part of the reason they're the number 15 overall seed and not like the number 8 or 9 overall seed. On talent, they're better than that. And that's part of the issue. Like they've got real guys in the rotation. Aiden May is going to pitch the opener. They've got one of the top, 3 to 5 players in the country in Travis Pizzana. They've got veteran leadership in the lineup. They've got guys that give you different looks in the bullpen. It's guys with postseason experience. Like it's a tough matchup for Kentucky. That's certainly the one where, I guess Georgia's got a tough one with NC State too, but that's one where, I don't think anybody's going to be shocked if Oregon State goes in there and just and just comes out of there, whether it's in 2 games or 3, comes out of there having looked like the better team over the course of the weekend. Because on talent, this matchup's pretty close. It's just like I said, like the Pac-12 wasn't very good this year, so that kind of hurt Oregon State's resume, and they did sleepwalk through part of the year, and so their resume got hurt to the point where they followed the 15 line, and that ends up being a tough matchup for both. Because honestly, Oregon State should be higher up and should have an easier matchup than Kentucky, and Kentucky would have wanted that too to not be facing Oregon State. So that isn't. I'm with you, Nick. That one is very interesting. Joey on YouTube says a good number of Tennessee's losses are being unable to recover from what the openers gave up. I mean, that's fair. But in lieu of having starting pitching like they've had, it's just kind of been what they've had to do. They've been spoiled the last couple of years with having Dolander and Burns and Beam in the rotation. Boom, boom, boom. And even when Burns last year wasn't, was struggling a little bit as in a starting role. Still, you were looking at 3 premium starting pitchers. It hasn't been that this year, so they're just kind of working with what they got. But I'm with you. Like there is a little bit of a risk there, right? Like what if Evansville puts a 5 spot in the first inning? I still think Tennessee's okay, but that does create a little bit of pressure, right? So I get it. Yeah, totally get it there. Kurt Cohn on Facebook asks, unrelated to the SEC, but I'll allow it. Did East Carolina blow an opportunity by losing a home regional considering all the upperclassmen on that team? I would say yes. And it's upperclassmen, yes, but I would say the bigger blown opportunity is having starting pitching like they've had this year with Savage and Root. That's the hard part for ECU. ECU always has functional offenses. They always play well at home. The difference between the ECU teams that you think could actually break through to Omaha and the ones that are just, good teams that are just postseason teams and not much more is the quality of the starting pitching. So when they had Gavin Williams and Carson Wisenhunt on the same team, they get to a super regional against Vanderbilt. This team, and if they have, a fully healthy Savage and Root down the stretch, perhaps they're not on the 16 line and they're higher up and they get a better matchup, yada yada. But to me, that's the part that hurts. Is you had the 1-2 in the rotation that could have got you at Omaha, and now Savage going to be a draft, obviously, and Zach Root is in the transfer portal. So, blown opportunity, but that's also kind of life at East Carolina. It just kind of feels like it's always something. With East Carolina that keeps them from getting there. But the beauty of it from ECU standpoint is they're going to be good again next year. Like they just are. And I can't tell you how or who's going to be the centerpiece of it, but they're going to be good next year. That's just what they do. Nicholas Doherty on YouTube. How many SEC teams do you think move on to Omaha? I got asked this on a podcast last week. And I went with 3. That feels like the safe answer, right? I just think there's enough tough matchups with, in particular, NC State against Georgia and Kentucky dealing with Oregon State that I think, unless you're convinced Florida could beat Clemson, which I think is on the table, but I'm not sure I'm betting on it. It just seems like, one of those 2 could go the opposite way of the SEC. Florida loses to Clemson, that opens the door for 3 to move on. I'd believe anything from 2 to 4, I think. But we'll see. Cameron Carter on YouTube. Still following, even though my Tigers aren't in it. We'll be back next year, though. Thanks for all you did this year. Oh, thank you, Cameron. Thanks for following along. And I appreciate all of you who are still following along, even if your teams are out of it. I appreciate your views and supporting what we're doing here and following along with college baseball, even if your team's out of it. Yeah, I suspect LSU will be just fine in the long run. And I've actually said during this season that LSU underwhelming this year, and they came on strong late. They were playing obviously really well. They were down the stretch. They played like a top 10, top 15 team, but they dug too deep a hole to where they couldn't get into the host spot. And that's how you end up matched up with a really good UNC team. And that happens. But I've said that LSU being underwhelming this year might be good for the rest of the SEC teams this year, but might be bad news next year. Because now, like, Jay Johnson's sitting at home just working the transfer portal and, putting together a team for 2025. And he's going to be frustrated because the team didn't go as far this year as he would have liked. So, the payback might be on the other end there for LSU. So we will see. Sean Miller on YouTube. This weekend is the one time of year I rue not being able to watch Pack baseball. Was the Ducks pitching a weekend miracle? Their ERAs are 5-6 over the course of the season. What is real? Well, yeah, Sean, I'm certainly not going to lie to you and pretend to be some sort of expert on Oregon's, the individual pitchers on Oregon staff, because I do have access to watch Pac-12 Network, but because I'm covering SEC games during the weekend, it's hard for me to zone in on that. But I would say with Oregon, because my colleague Mike Rooney talks about them a decent bit, and I talked to him about them, it's real in that they do a really good job of managing the game. And by that, I mean, some of the ERAs might not look great, but it's because they understand, like, okay, this is a game where our offense is clicking. Let's leave a guy out there a little longer. He's going to give up some runs, but let's just roll with him. Let's manage the game. Also, I think part of it is that they're just working with a different type of pitcher than a lot of what you see in the SEC. Now, SEC ERAs were high this year too, because it was an offensive year, at least during the regular season. So, but I would say that Oregon State, and this is typical of the West Coast, a lot less swing and miss, a lot more balls in play. And I think when you have more balls in play, you have more volatility. You're going to allow more runs. I mean, that's not hard to understand. So I think that's part of what's going on. So I think it's real, but I would say from an A&M standpoint, Oregon's pitchers don't scare you. And that's no disrespect. Oregon's had a really nice year. I was on Oregon as probably the number 2 team in the pack behind Oregon State. And Oregon was just really consistent this year. And Norman Jerome has jumped in on X and says, let's go Ducks. I'm hoping for a good series out there. I don't love that from an Oregon standpoint that it's going to be high 90s in College Station at points this weekend. That seems like not a great mix for a team from the Pacific Northwest. But it wouldn't shock me. Look, one thing that Mark Wazakowski has done at Oregon, like, talent was never a problem at Oregon when George Horton was there. It was kind of just like putting that talent together and putting a good team on the field. Like, this team plays with an edge with Waz now. That's one thing he's really done, is that this team just plays with so much more fire and edge than they did before. So, like, you're going to get their best shot. Like, Oregon's going to come to play, and it's either going to be good enough or it's not. And I would suspect not. I'm obviously picking A&M in that one, but you're going to get a good shot. They're not going to come out flat. That's my feeling on it. Scott Hankoski on Facebook. Great show as always. Thank you, Scott. What was the last year the number 1 team won it all? Something like 99? Indeed, 99. Now, there's been a number of teams that have gotten to Omaha as number 1 overall seeds, but yeah, have not won it since 99. I picked Tennessee at the beginning of the tournament to win the national title, so I'm picking that curse to be broken, but we shall see. Jay, I see your question about the South Carolina hire. We'll talk about that here in just a second. So I will get to that. Dave on YouTube says, finally caught one of these live. Love the content, Joe. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate you. Dave also says, Mississippi State going to have to rebuild almost the whole roster this offseason unless some younger guys step up. Yeah, that is kind of the reality of it. So if you're a State fan, you appreciate that team got back to the postseason, gave you a good season, gave you some forward momentum, but at the same time, you're kind of starting over in a lot of ways. But now at least you have some confidence that staff kind of building it back up, given what this year's team accomplished. But yeah, the expectations at State are high, obviously, and they should be. And so that staff, just because they had a good season this year, that goodwill will not necessarily cover everything next season if it's a little bit rough to start. So that'll be fascinating to watch. I'll get to you in a second, Bill. I was meaning to click on Josh here. Super regional most intriguing to you and the one you're most excited for this weekend, best chance for an upset. I think best chance for an upset is NC State taking on Georgia. I just think the combination of sometimes NC State plays better in these things away from home. They have a history of playing tight at home in some home regionals and super regionals. Now, not last weekend. They looked good last weekend. So that combined with the fact that Georgia doesn't have shutdown pitching, they're better. But the fact they don't have shutdown pitching is going to open up the possibility that they could just get got by NC State. I like NC State's pitching talent better. Now, NC State also some pretty rough pitching numbers, but they also have been better of late. I think I like the balance of the pitching talent at State a little bit better. There's a little more experience, right? Sam Heifels pitched in Omaha. Dom Fritton's been there for a while. So I just like the way it stacks up a little bit better. I think it's going to be an offensive super regional. And now, because I say that, it's going to be a bunch of 3-1 games. That's just the way those tend to go. But that one's the one I think I have most on upset alert. The most intriguing one, I think, is now that I think about it, that Kentucky-Oregon State one, just because it feels like just a nightmare for both teams to have to deal with each other in that situation. Bill Wahlberg on YouTube. I feel like the national audience is going to root for the underdog Beavers in Pac-12 conference, which is being destroyed and dismantled by Phil Knight, Nike, and NIL money. Sad. Yeah, I do think there's like a little bit of that folks will be rooting for the underdog Oregon State, not just because of the dismantling of the Pac-12, but also just like, there's folks who just root against the SEC or in football root against the Big Ten, like the big conferences. And I get that. Like, I totally get that. I don't hold that against anybody. So yeah, I think you're right, Bill. Like there will be a lot of Oregon State sentiment in this one, but I do think more so than most SEC teams, I do think there are some folks that have climbed aboard this, kind of Kentucky train because you're not used to seeing Kentucky baseball at this stage. So I do think there is some element of like, this is not LSU or one of the Mississippi schools or Arkansas who have 20 years of history or more of being in this position. So there's a little more positive feeling, I think, there among neutrals anyway. Jake on YouTube, how big of an advantage is it for UT to have a single SEC team remaining on their side of the bracket? I think it helps. Because yeah, when you get to Omaha, like that means you wouldn't have to face another SEC team until you get, until you get to the finals, right? If that's the way it's working out. I was going to pull up the bracket. I mean, I believe you. I was just going to visualize the bracket in my head here, so I'm pulling it up. Yeah, I mean, and of course UNC is a very good team. Like all that caveats, right? Like I know you're not saying that the other teams aren't good, but I do think it helps because in addition to the SEC teams just being super talented, there's also the familiarity, right? Like nobody's gonna go up against any other SEC team and be like, oh, we can't beat this team because, well, I mean, you may have played that team this year and you played a bunch of teams like them, right? So there's no mystique there. But there's a little mystery about we haven't played Carolina or Florida State, right? Virginia. So yeah, I do think there is an advantage. How much of an advantage we'll see, but I do think there is some inherent advantage there. Okay, chances of an all SEC ACC Omaha. Well, I mean, it's probably not going to happen just because you need so many things to happen, right? Like you need so many dominoes to fall a certain way, but it is on the table. Of course, teams like UConn upsetting Florida State or Oregon State beating Kentucky could upset that apple cart. But yeah, Justin, it could happen. It's a matter of all those pieces falling into place. All right, let's talk South Carolina. Thank you for all your good questions there and comments. I love that part of it. So they fight South Carolina. I forget the wording they used, but for all intents and purposes, fired Mark Kingston last Monday. And I wrote a column on the site earlier this week on Monday night about how this felt inevitable. That from the beginning of his tenure, there was this always felt like the way this was going to end, whether it took 4 years or 6 years or 7 years as it did, or 8 or 9 years. There was just always a subset of people invested in South Carolina who thought that he was never the right hire. They thought that there should have been a bigger fish out of the pond for South Carolina. Now, never mind the fact that, Mark Kingston went to regionals 2 or 3 years as the coach of South Florida in an American Athletic Conference that at that time was really good. He took Illinois State which was like a also ran program, to its first regional, or its third regional, I'm sorry, in program history, and first in a long time. He'd been to Omaha as an assistant at Miami and Tulane. So like he had history and pedigree. Like this wasn't a guy that they brought up from a D2 school, right? So there was some history there, but for a certain subset of people, it was like, where's the SEC experience? Where's the Omaha trips as a head coach? Where's the, the long track record as a head coach of getting to the postseason? And I get that, but for those people, that was always a hang up. And so he was going to have to work extra hard to get those people on board. And I think the thing that really kept him from being able to earn more goodwill was that the inconsistency, right? Super regional in the first year and miss regionals the next year. It was like postseason, no postseason, off and on. That just makes it hard for people to get on board, because it always feels like you're moving forward or moving back. There's no linear progression. It was just up and down and up and down. And then even the years where they had success, there were things that were giving detractors fuel. Like last year, they get to a super regional, but there were some people who viewed that as, well, we were a top 5 team at one point. And so we kind of backed our way into hosting and then got to a super. But as a top 5 team, you're talking about Omaha. You didn't get there. Or this year, where they made back-to-back regionals for the first time in a decade, and that should be seen as a positive. However, people hung on to, well, yeah, but a month ago we were talking about hosting, and then we lost 6 straight SEC games, and then we had to win some games in Hoover just to make sure we got into the doggone thing. And then we go 1-2 in a regional, and we just kind of like limp out. So even the positive seasons on paper had things that critics could hang on to, right? And so he just never could buy enough goodwill to convert the skeptics, I guess is the clearest way to put it. So Kendall Rogers has a hot board out. And if you believe the hot board, and you should, because Kendall spends a ton of time on the phone doing these things, he doesn't just throw names against a wall out of nowhere. They're shopping in a pretty expensive aisle here. I mean, Dan McDonald, Louisville, Tom Walter from Wake Forest, Chris Pollard at Duke, Cliff Godwin at East Carolina. Like, those are established guys who are not going to come cheap. They're not going to come easy. You're going to have to put together a compelling package and guarantee things, not just in terms of their salaries, but assistant coaching salary pools, recruiting budgets, NIL stuff. Like, they're going to have to come strong with that. And even at the second level, there's some really high-end assistant coaches here. Josh Elander from Tennessee, Josh Jordan at LSU. Like, those are guys with long track records of being on the bench for good teams and guiding teams to deep postseason runs. So they've got some intriguing options there. One of the more interesting ones is Monty Lee. Now, his name has come up. He is currently, let me get his exact title because I don't want to, Kendall Liston is just the hitting coach, but he's more than that. He does some of the defensive stuff too, but yeah, the hitting coach primarily. Obviously Clemson's head coach for a while, but Clemson moved on from him after they weren't thrilled with the way things were going. So I don't know if you're South Carolina, can you sell that hire? Like, it feels like he would run into some of the same problems Kingston did, in terms of there's going to be certain subset of people who aren't going to buy into that initially, and he's going to have to earn that goodwill. And that's a hard thing to do, as Mark Kingston showed us. So this will be interesting. I think my bottom line is this. I don't have any predictions for who they'll hire. That's more of a more of a Kendall thing. Stay tuned to whatever he writes on that. What I would say is that what they decide to do, South Carolina, in terms of NIL and how much they want to compete for the top end transfers, compete with the top end of the SEC in terms of what everybody's doing. That investment, both in terms of money and also in terms of just like focus on things, is a lot more important than who's in the dugout. Because I think you'll get a good coach, but you look at, let's just use the example of, look at the transfer classes for LSU and Tennessee and A&M recently, and then look at South Carolina's. Now, good players at South Carolina, right? I mean, there's been some transfers that have had really nice years, like Garrett Gainey, Chris Veach, Ty Good. Like those are your best pitchers. They were all transfers. There's plenty on the position player side too. So that's not a criticism of the players they've gotten, but they weren't in the game consistently for Braden Montgomery and Tommy White and Maui Ahuna and, on and on and on in terms of the big name transfers those three programs in particular have gotten. Can that change? Those are the types of questions that need to be asked. And I don't know that the head coach is necessarily the most important piece of that puzzle if they want to operate in that space. So I wrote in my piece that, look, when South Carolina was last at its peak, Kentucky was a bad program. Georgia was on the way down. Tennessee was a bad program. Auburn was a bad program. Now, all of those teams, those teams from the East are playing in super regionals right now. Auburn has obviously been to Omaha 2 of the last 4 years. It's just a different SEC. So like you can't even just go back to doing what you were doing under Coach Tanner at the end. Like that wouldn't be good enough in today's SEC. It's just different. 4 programs have won their first national title since South Carolina last has. Vanderbilt, Florida, and the Mississippi schools. So it's just tough. So again, go get a good coach. Roll out the red carpet, back up the Brinks truck, whatever it takes to get a good coach. But also don't just assume that an accomplished coach is going to be enough to necessarily fix all the problems, I think is my bottom line there. All right. So a few more questions here. Jake asked, would South Carolina be interested in Josh Elander? Does Josh want a head coach position given how long he has been with Tony V and his South Carolina opening he'd be interested in? Well, I can't speak for Josh. I don't know him, but I would think anybody with SEC assistant coaching experience would be interested in South Carolina. It's a good job. There are better ones in the SEC, but it's a good job. So yeah, I would think he would be interested. I would think South Carolina would be interested in him. And I'm pretty certain he wants to be a head coach. Most coaches, there are exceptions, but most coaches get into this business, and after they've been in an assistant role for a while, they want the opportunity to run their own program. So I would assume, at least, that he wants to be a head coach. I'd assume there'd be mutual interest, but we shall see. Kurt asked about Monty Lee getting hired. Yeah, I'm dubious of that because I think it'd be a tough sell from the South Carolina standpoint. Now, I think they could do worse, right? But I'm dubious of that from South Carolina standpoint, but we'll see. With Texas basically being an SEC team at this point, do you see Texas moving on from Pierce? That is more of a Kindle question, and I'm not saying that just to push that question off, but because I'm not covering Texas day-to-day yet, I don't have a feel for that. But also, Texas's season's been over for a week, and we haven't really heard anything on that. So, well, not quite a week, but you know what I mean. So with a job like Texas, you'd think they'd want to move on quickly if they were going to move on. So I'm just kind of looking at it from that standpoint and saying that I'm a little bit skeptical, but we will see. Scott Hankoski on Facebook. Lance Berkman left Houston Christian and Jose Cruz Jr. is at Rice. Have you heard anything about his job after the last 3 years of trying to fill in after Wayne Graham? That's going to be tough for any coach at Rice. Funny you ask, Scott, because Rice actually was my hometown team when I was growing. A bunch of family members who went to Rice. It's just a hard job now. Like Rice is not the job it was 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. I think you can't be as bad as they've been the last few years and continue in that direction, right? They did play better second half of the year. I think they're clinging on to that as a reason for, hey, we're moving in the right direction, reason for optimism. But I just think Rice has to have two things can be true at the same time. One is there needs to be a realization about what the job is now, not what it used to be. And then secondarily, also realize that, look, if you want to maximize even what you are right now, you have to be bought into baseball. And I guess I don't know the inner workings, and also Rice is a private school, so it's hard to really get a feel for the inner workings. But it's been my impression that they're not as invested in baseball as I think anybody involved would like them to be. And especially given their history, right? So we'll see. And with Berkman, Houston Christian, like, I just feel like, I mean, that's an even tougher job, obviously, because they don't have the history and the facility and all that stuff of Rice. They're in a worse conference. But, with guys like that, and I don't doubt Berkman had good intentions and wanted to win like everybody does. But, like, as a former big leaguer at some point, I think some of these big leaguers just get to a point where they're like, I don't need this, like, and they have to decide if they want to double down or if they just want to get out. And maybe that's the ultimate decision Lance came to. Corey Collins, Eric Bowers, that's Corey Collins and Charlie Condon the best 1-2 punch in the sport. Yeah, it might be. I thought it might be Jack Caglione and Colby Shelton before the season, but Condon and Collins has been better. So preliminarily, yes. Christian Moore, Blake Burke, also good, but Condon's better than, so it's tough. But yeah, they're certainly in that mix, if nothing else. And then Gary asks, what are the Florida Gators' chances to go to Omaha? They got a puncher's chance. I think the best thing that Florida could have going for it is that, does Clemson get tight when the reality of getting back to Omaha for the first time in a long time for a proud program starts to hit them, right? I have no doubt that Clemson's going to come out like gangbusters ready to play, like a lot of energy. Here we go. What happens when they're trying to close out the first game if they're winning, right? Or what happens in a clinching game if it gets there? Like, do they get tight? Like, I think Florida is playing with house money in a lot of ways. I think we saw that last weekend. That can be a powerful thing. So they've got a puncher's chance, Gary, for sure. Like, I'm not shocked if they come out of that super regional this weekend. Josh Dycheski says James Tibbs and Cam Smith for Florida State, pretty good tandem too. Absolutely. That's a good call, Josh. I appreciate that. All right, folks, that's going to be it. 36 minutes in. I got to get on the road to Clemson, so I'm going to call it there. All right, folks, I'll be back tomorrow morning with Saturday's Weekend Waypoints. We're going to preview all of the rest. We're going to talk about Tennessee's game today. We're going to preview all of the rest of the super regionals, and get you going from there. So enjoy the games today, both the Tennessee game and the games not involving the SEC. Super Regional Weekend, always a lot of fun. So enjoy the games. I will talk to y'all tomorrow morning.